It's not just the answers, not just the quotes. It's life in the margins. It's time for Cluffs Notes.
The Scientist.
When I was growing up, I changed schools 12 times. In fact, I changed schools so often that I never even took a science class that involved an actual lab. I never wore safety glasses, never mixed chemicals, dissected anything, or even used a Bunsen burner. But in spite of that, I've always had the mind of a scientist. And I've come to love experimentation as a way to explore the world. I think teaching and leadership are all about experimentation. So it made sense that if I wanted to learn more, I might try a kind of experiment. Not the kind of experiment that was meant to prove something to someone. More like something I could run just to understand myself better. Because through my sketching, my AI conversations, that swirl committee structure, I was getting this better idea of how my mind works, how things connect. And even though I had enough coherence in my committee structure to move forward, there were still parts in my head that felt unfinished. They weren't wrong and not broken. It was just unclear. So, for example, in 2 of my committee sketches, the images were just incomplete. I deliberately left white space on them because I knew there was still more I needed to learn before they could settle in my head. For example, when I finished my pattern committee, I felt done. In my distillation committee, I could move forward, but I still had unanswered questions. And I guess it was that pull to better understand those that led me to conduct this experiment at one more level. And before I could start any kind of formal data collection, I decided I did want to bring in one more perspective. Again, nerdy. And I didn't do it to correct me, not to validate anything, but I just thought, I want to see if there's something I'm missing. I find this interesting, but what am I not thinking about? So I used another AI platform, and I sort of use it as a peer review partner. And again, not to analyze the conclusions that we were discussing in our other committees, but just help me with the process itself. I gave it artifacts from my swirl journey. I gave it reflections and the committee notes and visuals. And I just asked questions like, okay, where is there alignment? Where is there lack of clarity? Where are there gaps? And although that feedback, it didn't dramatically change anything, it did lead to some small adjustments that were helpful. But maybe more importantly, it just gave me a little confidence to move forward.
The experiment. The nerdy part.
So most of my reflective journey would best be described as exploration in nature. However, I knew if I wanted to explore my thinking more deeply, I was going to need to be more deliberate. I was going to have to be more structured. So from what we did in education, I created something closer to what I would call reflective field research. Back on the school campuses, when we gathered information about students from a classroom, we used protocols to make sure that that data was clean and useful. We needed it to be consistent, so it would allow us to compare apples to apples. Data has way more value when it's not clouded by our interpretation. Instead of saying the student got mad or embarrassed in class, we would say when the teacher called on the student, he raised his voice, he yelled, "Stop it," and he pulled his jacket over his head. The goal was simple, just capture what happened without projecting conclusions or assumptions. If I wanted useful research data about my thinking, I needed to approach my experiment in that same way. I was going to be asking these AI conversations for this big picture review of that conversation. And I didn't want interpretations and conclusions. I just wanted data of what was observed as I went through different cycles of this reflection. So again, no more Peppa Pig. If this is too much, I apologize. I had recently been experimenting with protocols in these conversations. I was asking for ways to synthesize large chunks of conversations. And so with that in mind, I went into my sense-making studio and I thought, okay, this is a perfect place to help me design that protocol that we'll use. And I started with what I knew and began developing this protocol for key aspects of that swirl in hindsight. I was just trying to find specific things like what triggered the reflection, how did the thinking move outside my head, when and how did connections begin to form, how did ideas begin to condense or distill. It was nothing fancy, and I share all those details just because maybe that aligns with your nerdiness. Because it was actually kind of fun. I'd draft this protocol, I'd run a test, bring the results back to my committee, we'd explore them together, I'd adjust the wording, I'd refine the prompts, I'd run it again, and then that cycle would come back, making sure it was not going to be focusing on assumptions, interpretations, or conclusions. And when I had it working the way I thought it would be helpful, I started gathering the data. Some of the field notes were captured in real time, but one of the most helpful parts, I think, of this experiment was I was able to go back and revisit these past conversation threads. I'd find an earlier conversation and say, run a swirl protocol on this. And a few moments later, boom, I had my field note for that conversation. And because I use AI so often to explore my swirl thinking, I had a range of conversations I could pull from. I honestly was not trying to control for every variable. It wasn't that kind of experiment. I was not trying to make this defensible. And I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone else. I just simply wanted enough of those quality examples that I could start examining for patterns. Another reel for the shelf.